Okay, I think we should get started. What do you think?
I have a title. Well, I probably can't say that word.
You have a title? What does that mean?
A lot of blankety blank forms.
A lot of forms, a lot of new forms that are coming out. In fact, what we would want to do is kind of rehash where we are in the, these new changes, what we're hearing from some of our clients and how they're working through it, some of the good, some of the bad, and use the forms to kind of drive that conversation. And Dad, so I'm going to share my screen. Here's the key. With any of these forms, first they get published and then they get shared with the individual vendors, Form Simplicity, app files, whatever the different companies are. And because of the amount of new forms that are coming through, the vendors are taking a long time to publish. So if you want the latest form, I would suggest going directly to the source. So in this case, you go right to NABOR.com, and they actually did us a favor. They outlined all the newest forms that have been updated this year. There are more to come. In fact, I spent last week going over with the Forms Committee on some of the changes to the sales contracts and some of the other options that they're trying to work through. There's a lot going on. Dad, in fact, there's some things that are we're seeing come into play with the legislature here in Florida. Specifically, there's a new flood disclosure requirement, which is going to mandate a seller to disclose any sort of flood water. So not necessarily interior flooding, like a washing machine that flooded, but anything that was like maybe an exterior force, like a storm or something. There is going to be an obligation for the seller to disclose that to a buyer.
We have a case on that we wrote about in the past.
Yeah, this is a good thing. I don't think this changes much. Do you think this changes a ton?
No, because there's case law out there that it's a question of fact whether or not a place has been flooded affects its fair market value. Even if it was fully fixed, does it affect its fair market value? Two condos side by side, one was flooded, totally fixed. The other one was never flooded. Which one would you pay more for?
Right. Right. So the legislature is requiring us to disclose this per state law, as opposed to simply something that was, maybe a case precedent like Johnson v. Davis. Johnson v. Davis, I heard an argument recently. So for just to give a quick summary, that was a lawsuit. I think it was based in Miami. Is that right, Dad?
I think so. It was 1985, and it was over a roof, maybe a $300,000 sale, and it might have been 15 to 30,000 in repairs that were required. What's interesting about that case, you go back to 85, you can almost see the arc of responsibility increase on the sellers and the listing agents over the last almost 40 years. More and more stuff needs to be disclosed, starting from 85, where it's kind of minimal, to now it's almost anything.
Yeah. So the wording, and this I thought was interesting, because I don't know if you and I have talked about this. The wording that they use, the seller of a home, if the seller of the home knows of facts materially affecting the value of the property, which are not readily observable and are not known to the buyer. So readily observable. So I heard an attorney make the argument that radon or mold is not observable. What do you think of that? Is observing simply like visual, or could it also include instrument tests? Do they make
it includes all that, and it also includes the responsibility of the buyer to have an inspection. If the buyer had had an inspection, would this have come out? And in this case, it would have with the spore count, perhaps. Although I always tell the buyers, if it rained the night before, the outside number is going to be really, really low, because the spores have been wiped out of the air. If the place had been recently cleaned, it may be artificially low. Where was the collection of spores made? Out of which returns? So that's one of those things where how much work does the buyer have to do to avoid this? And when we were in the middle of COVID and people were waiving inspection periods and buyers were waiving inspections, that's the thing that frightened me about the whole thing, because, there's a burden on the buyer
Yeah.
to do a certain amount of digging.
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, and Sigrid actually makes a clarifying point. Is this the same form as the required insurance disclosure? So they actually haven't really shown this form in my experience. I don't think it's out yet. So there isn't the form just yet. There is one form that's always been in the books, and I'll show you what that one looks like. This is called the Addendum to Sales Contract Insurance Unavailability due to extreme weather conditions. There's this form. There might be some other forms in there. In fact, I think there is. Let's
I
see
don't think
this
I've
one.
ever seen that attached to a sales contract to be.
Yeah, to be candid, I haven't either. This is another one due to recent amendments to state and federal law. Flood insurance premiums and homeowners insurance premiums may increase, and in some instances, increase substantially. So this one was dated recently. So actually, this is August 17th. I
Yeah.
don't think this was kind of hidden. It should be way up here. So Sigrid, thanks for that clarification there. But
Now,
this
Christian, if you look at all the forms, if you go below the new ones and see just all the forms we have, it'd be interesting to just do a study of how often do we see any of these forms.
Yeah,
What are
this
what
is
are the
one
most
that you
commonly
will
used
see.
forms that we see floating through our office?
So this is the one we will see. So I think this is the newest one that NABOR has released. Unfortunately, they buried it. They did not put it at the top like they did all the other new forms.
Yeah.
But this one is, per federal, state and federal law, flood insurance premiums and home insurance premiums may increase, and in some
Right.
instances increase substantially over previously charged premiums. As a result, buyers are advised not to rely on current premiums. Prior to entering the sales contract, buyers are advised to consult with one or more insurance underwriters. That really has changed quite a bit. Dad, you and I have done these videos now for almost 3 years. In my experience, insurance was always something you did like the last week or two of closing, before closing. And that has drastically changed. Now it's something you do before even going under contract. When did you start seeing that shift?
Probably in the last year.
Yeah.
There was something in Saturday's Wall Street Journal on this, Christian, and how in Florida, insurance premiums, in particular for condos, have gone up anywhere from 150 to 500%. But they're looking at the risk, and they're looking at the Surfside special assessments. Those two together is causing a real issue with the condo market. In fact, today's Naples Daily News front page story is quoting the governor, and we need to do something to help the condos out with these special assessments, because
Yeah.
they're really onerous on existing owners, some of them,
Yep.
the older buildings.
Yep, exactly. So here's that flood disclosure. Homeowners insurance policies do not include coverage for damage resulting from floods. Buyers encouraged to discuss the need to purchase separate flood insurance coverage with buyer's insurance agent. And the seller actually has to fill this out. Seller has or has not filed a claim with an insurance provider related to flood damage on the property, including but not limited to a claim with the National Flood Insurance Program. Seller has or has not received federal assistance for flood damage. Interestingly enough, the way that our political environment has gone, FEMA has been paying people on claims even if they weren't insured. So this is actually interesting because you may not have filed a claim, you may not have even had flood insurance, but you received some financial assistance from FEMA. That is possibly where that question is coming from. And then they specify specifically what flood means. And this is where it defines, it's not something interior. It's not like a flood from a washing machine. So this is a good form. This is something I would start using right away.
And there's another reason for using it right away. And I've done this in a seminar with Chris Mitchell, a local insurance agent. What's a defective item in NABOR? What is not a defective item in NABOR may be required to be rectified by your insurance agent when you apply for a policy. For example, they might want a new roof, even though the existing roof is not leaking. They might want the polybutylene pipes replaced, even though it's not a defective item. So, seminars I put on with Chris, he said, you should go to your insurance agent early so that the agent would know what to put in the contract as a defective item, so that buyer will be able to get insurance.
Yeah. So let's see if we can make this a TikTok moment. Here are the things every buyer needs to know about insurance, specifically flood insurance. Number one, flood insurance is underwritten by the federal government. So it's FEMA, even though you get it through a local broker, it is FEMA, it is available for everybody. It is not subject to, the whims of a private insurer. So it actually is good. It will always be there. Number two, it is limited in how much it can go up from year to year. I think there's a federal law that limits it to like a 13% increase. Don't quote me on the total amount, but it does have certain limitations, which leads to the important part of issue number three. It is really a good idea to get the seller's flood policy assigned to the buyer. So if you're going to make an offer on a property and you know the seller has flood insurance, or even if you don't, but you're going to want it, put in there that seller shall assign their existing flood policy, if there is one, at closing, something like that. And so that way you can take advantage of, one, it can be a little simpler to get the policy, but also you're locking in that low cost because it can't go up so much from year to year. It does have limitations on how much it offers. It limits it to, what the repairs are, but that's all set by FEMA and federal law. So there's our TikTok moment, Dad. You ready for famous, being famous?
No.
Okay, good. Done. That's perfect. All right. So this insurance disclosure, I believe it's obligatory starting October 1st. So start using it now, put it in every deal, flood disclosure, and you just have the seller fill it out in advance with all the other things that we now ask agents to put together.
Well, and again, you could turn it to your advantage, because ultimately, if you're a listing agent, you want your deal to sell and you want it to close. And if you provide this information with your seller disclosure, even though you at the moment may not be required to do so, it increases the odds that your property will actually disclose. And encourage, and if you're on the other side, encourage your buyer to check out with an insurance agent what requirements they have to issue insurance.
Yeah,
because they may differ from what's in the contract.
Yep, exactly. Dad, you ready for the next form that they updated recently?
Oh, goody.
Oh, goody. So this is the buyer broker agreement, property specific. So we've been trying to kind of manipulate the exclusive buyer agreements to be specific to one property. This form was made for that purpose. So you can use this. In fact, they lead with their biggest bat here. You can just specify what properties you're going to go see. So a lot of talk has happened, and there's a lot of people that are doing videos and posting them online. And I think what they're talking about is, how do you pitch this to a buyer that you don't really know? You're testing each other out. And so this form actually could be a real lifeline to us. If you've never worked with this buyer before, you're still deciding if you're going to be a good fit for each other, but you need something. So this form, you could say, all right, let's plan on, going out and looking at properties on Saturday or on Tuesday, whatever the date may be. I'm going to list all the properties that we're going to go see. You could fit more than 8, but they have room for 8 of them. You just throw them all on there, and then when you go to the first property or the night before, you say, hey, I need to have this form. It's just for the properties we're going to go see. Here's all listed. Let's sign it. If these aren't the properties you like or you want to move on, we'll have to do a separate form for that later. Everything else is pretty much the same on this. It's going to look very similar to what you're used to on the exclusive buyer broker agreement. The rest is correct, or what you're used to in that sense.
It's a little easier to get a buyer you haven't met to sign this than the exclusive.
Yeah,
it's just for these 2 properties, and you can put a short time period in there. It differs with Florida Realtors in that there's a protection period. So if they go back later on and ultimately cut a deal to buy those 1 or 2 properties you put on this form, you're protected for a certain time frame. The Florida Realtors one doesn't have the protection period. So I kind of like this one better than the Florida Realtors one.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit better.
You want the less threatening, especially if it's somebody you haven't met before.
Yeah, exactly.
It's up to the realtor and their style and what they feel comfortable with.
So I'm trying to find our message where we talked about how they kind of defined the three different agreements: the exclusive buyer broker agreement, the property pre-touring agreement, and the showing agreement. I can't seem to find that.
Your mother emailed that to you. You haven't put it out yet, Christian.
That's what it was. All right, can you talk to kind of generally what they were trying to get at as far as like how people are seeing these forms, how they look?
Well, the Florida Realtors has three basic ones, and it seems like NABOR is moving towards the same thing. At least they have two of the three. The exclusive, which is, the equivalent of being married, and the Florida
In
Realtors
all the
have,
great ways, right?
in all the great ways. Hopefully, you find somebody who can tolerate you for as long as your mother has tolerated me, which has been a long time. But I always visualize, my dad trying to show property to somebody he just met.
Yeah.
It takes a while to develop a relationship with a brand new person.
Yeah.
So this property specific form, which again is similar to the Florida Realtors one, except that you have the protection period and it may have a few other things, helps you
Look at
when
this,
you get
Dad.
a
I
phone
found
call
it. I did find it. All right. Let's see if I can pull it up and share it on my screen here. So just so that we can be concise, let me see if I can pull it up. You have the exclusive buyer agreement. It's the most comprehensive contract between a consumer and a broker. In this agreement, both parties consent to the broker's compensation regardless of how the consumer discovers or contracts to purchase, lease, or option the property. So that, that's what we're used to, is that buyer broker agreement. It gives you the best protection, the most expansive servicing of your customer, and then their loyalty in return to that. Let me see, I've got it pulled up right here.
Yeah.
Then you have, in contrast, here it is, Dad, you can probably see it, showing agreement. It's property specific, details the responsibilities of both the broker and the consumer. However, the consumer's obligation to the broker is limited only to the properties listed in the showing agreement. This type of agreement does not include a protection period or conditional termination clauses.
That's the Florida Realtor forms they're talking about.
They are talking about Florida Realtor forms. And then finally, the touring agreement, which NABOR doesn't have one of those. But a touring agreement, on the other hand, is established for a specific or specified duration, specifically a predetermined number of days. This form outlines the time frame and the buyer's compensation only. So in their view of this was published by Florida Realtors. In their view of it, you've got like the best, you've got good enough, and then you've got the minimum standards as far
as the general counsel for Florida Realtors, that Joanna Watkins, I watched the video and she looked at the two last forms, the showing and the touring, and she equated them to dating. Somebody flies in, there might be a friend of somebody that you sold property to, and they said good things about you, but they haven't physically met Christian Ross yet. So you might start out with a showing agreement. You might start out with a touring agreement. If it's a touring agreement, you might give them the weekend, whatever you are comfortable with. You're the realtor, you decide. And once you get to know each other, and you warn them up front, if we get along, I'm going to hit you with the exclusive one where we're essentially married. We're together, we're committing ourselves to each other, but to a total stranger who's referred to you from a prior client, you might get some blowback on signing the exclusive.
Yeah, you might, and ultimately have competition with someone else that might be talking to your potential customer as well. So Andy asked a question: what if a buyer comes to your open house and is interested in making an offer? You wouldn't have a buyer and broker agreement signed before you showed him the property. So we've talked about this previously. In fact, I'll use this as a shameless plug to go to our website or to go to YouTube. So youtube.com/Christian Ross, you'll see we've got over 160 videos. We talked about this recently because I think this is very important. This is something that is going to happen a lot. You're going to have an open house, or you're going to have someone that just reaches out, possibly because they don't want to sign one of these agreements. In that scenario, you can show them the property without having something signed because you are acting on behalf of the seller. You are an agent of the seller. So you can show them no problem whatsoever. it does start getting tricky once they want to make an offer. So, Dad, we watched the instructional video by Patty Ketchum, who's a broker in Florida, and you thought she maybe was a broker in Georgia as well. And her video, I don't remember, was it published by Florida Realtors as well?
Yes, it's under the Florida Realtors YouTube channel.
Yeah, so Patty did a wonderful job, and what I really liked about her, she's not the authority on this, but she's direct, she's concise, she's definitive, and really intelligent, a great salesperson, and in her mind, she was pretty clear about what you need at that point, and she said something that you liked as well, which was assume they have an agent. So the buyer shows up. They want to show the property, say, give me your agent's name and number, and I'll reach out to them after you leave and share all the information. She said she preferred that over assuming that they didn't have an agent. So am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, you're remembering it correctly. She said in her experience, she's not all over the person like an octopus. And what she's experienced was, you should say that the people go wandering around the house, they're interested in the house. They come up to her sheepishly, which is the word she used, and admit they do not have a realtor. How do we get the information? Then she can slip them with, and she liked the touring agreement. So that's her particular preference, but she leaves it up to the realtor which one of the three forms they go with.
So now we have a buyer, they want to make their offer. You cannot represent that buyer unless you have a signed agreement with them. So our preference would be for you to talk to that buyer about signing a buyer brokerage agreement. It is the best form you can do. And I would probably lean towards one of those buyer broker agreements, property specific. That's what I would look at. And I think that's a really good one because you've got them there. You can tell them that, here's what the seller will be paying. You won't be paying anything, but here's how we complete the form. That's the best because at that point, if they sign it, you can represent them. You can help them with forming an offer, with the negotiations with the seller.
Right.
Now, obviously, this assumes that you are a transactional agent in this scenario, and you'll have to disclose what your relationship is. In fact, on the form, the property-specific form, you have to specify what you are. And most likely, you would select transaction broker in this scenario.
And interestingly enough, 475 does require disclosure at that point, the earlier of entering into an agreement with somebody or showing them the property. And it has similar fact situations for open houses. It discusses open houses within the statute, which I found very interesting.
So this is where it gets a little tricky, Andy, is that now, let's say the buyer doesn't want to sign a buyer broker agreement, even if it's a property specific. What can you do then? I will start by saying you really need to follow what your broker is obligating you to do. Every broker has different rules, a different interpretation of it. I can only give you mine. And unfortunately, you can't take my opinion and prove the broker wrong. I wish you could. That'd be great. But in my opinion, I think a solution, assuming your broker has the ability to allow you to do this, I think you could put 0. I think you could put 0 there. You are the listing agent, so your listing agreement already compensates you the full amount. And so you put 0 here, and you should be fine. You're now representing the buyer and the seller. And yes, it's 0 and 5, or 0 and 6, or 0 and 3, whatever the numbers may be. And it's fine. But I have heard that there's some brokers that don't want it to look like that. They want it to match the listing agreement. So if on your listing agreement, let's see if I'll share the contract here. So here's your listing agreement. Again, this is a NABOR one, but you could be using any form. If you remember, it specifies here in K1 the total compensation that is being agreed upon, and then separately K2D specifies how much you are sharing with the buyer's broker. So some brokers have said that if this is, X and Y, that the buyer broker agreement should also say Y down here. It should match. So that would be the safest thing to do. But oftentimes you're not going to do that. You're going to put a 0 on the buyer broker agreement, and that will get your buyer to sign with you, to show your relationship. what your responsibilities are, to lock them into that one property and you. And then, you know, there's no obligation because it's a 0% on the list. So the buyers are more likely to sign it. You know, and then finally, if your broker allows it, the minimum standard would be, well, then have them sign a touring agreement, something like that.
Here's the, again, in defense of all brokers out there who may be making this inference, this is all new. They don't know. They're trying to do their best. But how do you handle a situation like this where there is no duty on the listing agent to show the agreement, the listing agreement, to the selling agent? You don't have to show them your listing agreement. And likewise, the buyer broker, except with this new NABOR form where, you know, they can cancel if you don't show the buyer broker agreement, there's no legal duty to share your written agreement with your buyer. It's a separate contract. You got two separate contracts. Maybe they'll fit, maybe they won't, but they're still two separate contracts.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then, so finally, there you've got your pre-touring agreement. Is this going to be enough for your broker in that event? Do you put 2.5? Do you put 1? Do you put 0? Whatever your number may be. This is something that you would sign with the buyer. It does not specify what your duties are, what your if you're transactional, single agent, something like that, or other. So a lot of brokers are hesitant to recommend this form, even if Dad, you and I like this form. You know, I think it's
this is Patty Ketch's favorite form. And to add to her resume, she's also at this moment on the Florida Real Estate Commission. She's one of the 7 people appointed by the governor and affirmed by the legislature. So this is going to be her go-to move, her best practice move. She's going to start with this and then hit them with the exclusive once they get to know each other.
Yep.
But everybody's different.
Everyone's different. Your broker is the one that kind of drives the train on this one, at least in the interim. You know, we wrote an article about this, Dad, as well. And Andy, if you want to look back at that, we called it good, better, best if you're a listing agent. So the best case is a buyer broker agreement protecting you not just on this property, but any property. The better would be a buyer broker agreement that's specific to this property or has some sort of nominal fee structure on there. And then the minimum standard, if your broker allowed it, would be some sort of pre-touring or showing agreement, possibly. So that's kind of how that works. So now we have a couple other questions about these forms. Yvonne asks, if I have a pre-recorded video walking through the property, do I have to get a showing agreement signed before I can send the video to the buyer?
I would say
I think the answer is yes, right, Dad?
it smells an awful lot like a virtual tour. It's just pre-recorded.
Yeah, so we would say yes. And, you know, do the FAQs and the settlement agreement specify otherwise? They don't really. Let's say, Yvonne, let's say you recorded a showing, you know, a walkthrough, and then posted it on Facebook. I don't think there's any problem there. I think that in that scenario, you're just you know, marketing yourself. You're marketing what you could bring to a buyer. You're not showing it to any one specific buyer. But if you texted that and said, hey, look at the property, this thing's great, I think that could be problematic for you. You know, they could see you as maybe trying to do a workaround. It could open you up to some sort of penalties with
It's very fact specific. It depends on what you say in the video. I mean, if you're just reciting factual things as the representative of the seller, you're probably safe. But if you start getting into some of the functions of real estate and advice and comparing it to other properties in the neighborhood and coming up with strategy and making an offer and all that BS, now you're in deep dog doo-doo.
And Yvonne, if you're the listing agent, I don't think that's problematic at all. Again, you are doing it on behalf of the seller. If you're not the listing agent, if you're just walking through a new community that some builder is offering, and they had an open house and you're taking videos and then you're texting them to individual buyers, that could be a violation. So please be careful with that. Andy has another question. If your listing agreement has 2.5 for the listing and 2.5 for the buyer agent, and you put 0, will you get the 5% at closing? So this also was addressed previously. So I would absolutely recommend looking at those and reading our articles about it. But in my opinion, your listing agreement actually says the full amount. You know, how much was the seller paying total and how much is being shared. If nothing is being shared, the seller's still paying the total under most listing agreements. So my argument is if you're representing both sides, it doesn't have to be half and half. It can be completely one-sided because you're on both sides anyways. It would be fine. But every broker is kind of going through this separately, and I would definitely talk to them before putting in the effort to get everything signed. But it's, we'll see exactly what happens. Yvonne says, if, to clarify, she was the listing agent in that scenario. If you're a listing agent, this is fine. You're doing it on behalf of a seller. You do not need separate agreements with everybody. Christina, you had a question. Please go ahead.
Hi, just to piggyback on exactly what we're speaking of. So Yvonne was the listing. If I'm a buyer broker going through a new community and videotaping and going into their showrooms or going into a model or one that is by another listing agent,
Yeah,
putting it on Facebook, putting it on social media, saying generalized terms like, come see this community, this property has such and such, there's no harm, no foul.
I don't think so. I can't imagine it. You're trying to promote your business. You're not sending it out to any one buyer. You're not doing it specifically because that buyer asked you to do it. Let's say on a different scenario, Christina, you were doing it for a specific buyer. And so you went there for Ben and Jerry because they've got the greatest ice cream ever. And so you go there and, this is great. It's going to be awesome. And you text it to them. Yes, you would need it with Ben and Jerry, obviously. But if then you took that same video and posted it on Facebook, I think you're fine. I think you're okay. I don't see a problem with that.
Your dad hasn't stopped smiling since you said ice cream.
I know. It's early in the day, but we still like
I was waiting for bananas. That's what I was waiting for. Banana ice cream. That'd be perfect.
All right, Karen asks, what if I'm just suggesting that a person review a listing through a realtor, for example, to see that if it might fit with their interest? So let me read that again. What if I am only suggesting that a person review a listing through realtor.com or whatever to see if that might fit with their interest? That is not equivalent to a showing. They specified that a showing comes to doing something in person or doing a video tour for that person.
It's triggered by the tour. So what's a tour?
What is a tour? Can you set them up on MLS to get a feed of relevant properties and get feedback from them? That seems to be perfectly fine, not a problem. But if you go to the next level and they say, hey, we like that one, but can you do a FaceTime with us? Then yeah, you've got to get something in writing with them, either a pre-touring agreement, showing agreement, or a buyer broker agreement, even if it says 0, because we also know that we can amend these buyer broker agreements. So that could be a really, it's a great opportunity, honestly. It's a good opportunity to evaluate your customer or potential customer, see how loyal they are going to be, or if as soon as money comes up, they start ghosting you.
And again, I would emphasize, this is really a matter of what the realtor feels about it, because I keep thinking of my own father. He'd go right for the exclusive listing, and he'd probably get it. I mean, if you're calm and you're comfortable with whatever form, that's the one you go with. Obviously, the best one from a legalistic perspective is the exclusive in both Florida Realtors and NABOR. But if you get any blowback from, say, your buyers for a New York attorney, something like that, whatever works. If you have to
everyone's different. Everyone has a different confidence level. The one thing we have noticed with some of our clients is that if they teach the customer on how it's going to work. So if you lay out the plan, we're going to sign this now at this percentage, and then we're going to start going and looking at properties. And then if you want to go to actually making an offer, then we will modify and we'll sign this form at this percentage based on what the listing agent is offering. And that's how we're going to move forward. And if the listing agent's not offering anything, here's what we're going to do. Here's how it will work. In fact, Dad, to bring that full circle, Patty Ketchum mentioned something that I thought was really interesting. She said, assuming your broker allows you to, you could put language in there that says, buyer instructs broker to only show properties where the listing agent is offering compensation. You could put that in there. It doesn't violate the settlement in any way, according to her, and I would agree with that. Assuming your broker allows you to, that could be a way to do it. And so let's say you put that in there, your own, that gives the buyer the comfort to write down whatever percentage that you agree to as your compensation. And then if you find a property where they're not offering anything, per your agreement, you don't have to show it to the buyer, but maybe use that as an opportunity to talk to the buyer and say, hey, we found this property, they're not offering compensation. Would you still like to see it? Because here's how it would work if you wanted to make an offer.
I honestly don't understand why she's putting that language in there. I really don't, because she followed that up with, but tell them that you'll show them.
You show them anyways.
I want your permission to show you everything, and make sure you have a witness with you when you tell them that.
Yeah.
So that just seemed odd to me.
I think it was her way of
Covering herself legally.
Covering herself legally, but still having the buyer sign something that they were comfortable signing. So it was a compromise, although she knew she still had to kind of present it because she didn't want to be steering them specifically. So yeah, it's tough advice to receive without understanding all the particulars.
I was wondering whether she was going to use that buyer broker agreement where they only want to be shown things that offered, some sort of compensation to the buyer's brokers. She's going to show that to listing brokers who were not permitted to pay any buyer broker compensation, to try to get them to change their minds.
So Lisa makes a point, and I want to clarify on this one. She asked, doesn't the NABOR BBA already state that? It actually doesn't. So Section 5 of the BBA, let me share my screen real quick. It specifies how much you charge as far as your services are concerned. And then and I wrote an article about this, of pointing this section out. It's already bolded, but I think this does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And it's kind of what Lisa might be referencing. And here it is. Provided, however, broker is authorized to negotiate for a seller/listing broker/landlord to pay all or a portion of the compensation. So this is why I want to point it out. We are going to try our darndest to get the seller to pay for all of this compensation. Buyer and broker acknowledge that seller may offer a credit to buyer at closing towards buyer's closing costs and prepaids, such as a seller concession. Buyer agrees that if seller's concession is provided and seller/listing broker/landlord is either not offering or to broker, or the compensation offered by them is less than the compensation due under this agreement, then seller's concessions will be used towards payment of the broker compensation under this agreement. So I think the first sentence is the most important. And I pointed out, and it's not exactly what Patty was referencing and what she would add. What this says is our first priority is to see if the seller will pay all of my compensation. That's our first priority. I'm going to ask on every single deal. And only if they refuse, would you be obligated to pay anything? At which point it's in black and white. It's the best you have with the standard form. If you needed to go a little bit further, you could. In fact, Dad, could you put, broker will not receive compensation above what the listing agent is offering? Could you put that in a buyer broker agreement?
I don't think that's ascertainable on its face. So I would say
it's tricky. It's tricky. I agree. I don't know. We'll have to think about that. I haven't seen that. First, I think two attorneys could probably argue. We
can argue about anything.
We can argue about that one for sure.
But yeah, it's tricky. As an additional sentence, Christian, that they use in their form that allows the agent that if they are the listing agent as well, they get compensation for services rendered to the seller that are above and beyond what compensation the buyer is paying.
Yeah.
So I like that with the Florida Realtors, that it specifically says that, hey, if I have the listing, I get that too.
Yeah, that is nicer to have that in there. It's going to give listing agents a competitive advantage because they can negotiate a lower rate with the buyer, or even possibly zero, as compared to any of the buyer's agents.
Yeah, they're going to know the concessions right away. I mean, they don't have to call anybody.
Yep, exactly. So those are excellent questions. Excellent questions. Let me see if there's something else on here that I wanted to point out. Oh, they do have a couple of things on here I wanted to point out. Let's see, let's pull them up. So as this time has continued to go forward, they have added more forms that help us a lot more, especially a lot more than FARBAR or FAR does. So they started adding these addendums to listing contract, limited broker services, addendum to sales contract concession. So this one I like because now they're not making you come up with the language, or Dad, you and I come up with the language. They're giving it to you. So if the seller wants to offer a concession, use the form. It's great. There's nothing wrong with the form. In worst case, if you needed this language, you could copy this and paste it into a FARBAR contract if you liked, put it in a FARBAR addendum. But basically, seller shall provide a credit to buyer at closing as follows. And you just put it right in there. And you just use the one that you need from that. They separately did the same thing, addendum to sales contract compensation. Listing broker agreeing to pay buyer's broker at closing, seller agreeing to pay buyer broker at closing. So a lot of people were doing this themselves. They were kind of creating some language, having their attorney create some language, and then putting it in other terms and conditions or in some sort of blank addendum. Now you can use these. This contract is contingent upon seller delivering to buyer not later than so many days after the effective date a copy of a binding agreement establishing compensation to be paid to buyer's broker upon the following terms. So Dad, in this case, what this addendum is doing is saying, listing agent will send me a compensation agreement within 3 days of going under contract, which guarantees that the buyer's broker is getting paid this amount.
That's the exception I referred to earlier when I was saying that you don't have to show them your buyer broker or you don't have to show them your listing agreement.
Well,
NABOR
maybe, but I think what they're referring to is this compensation agreement. So they're saying this needs to be provided within 3 days of going under contract. So this is broker to broker compensation. This would need to be provided within the 3 days.
Yeah, that wasn't
that's
clear.
what they're referring to.
I thought they were asking for a copy of the agreement you have with your buyer.
No, so this is binding
Private.
agreement establishing compensation to be paid to buyer's broker, which would be this compensation agreement.
Okay.
Yeah, so this would be fine. You know, if you don't have a compensation agreement at the time you make the offer, throw this in there, and then you can make your offer. You don't have to wait for the listing agent to respond to you. You can quickly get in there. So you put together a standard contract, and then you throw this as an addendum, not this one, but you throw this one as an addendum saying it's contingent upon getting some sort of compensation agreement at these terms. So I don't know. We'll see how much this is used. In my guess is that agents won't be comfortable putting an offer without knowing in advance that the compensation is guaranteed.
I like that it's an addendum. What you got to remember too is check off the block on the last page and identify the form because of the case law on that.
Oh, let's show him that. Here's the blocks that he's talking about. Maybe line 580, other, and you'd put in this form here, not that one. You'd put addendum to sales contract compensation. So you'd put that right under there. It's not letting me do it, but you'd put that and say this is attached as part of the offer.
Because the case we found on that was a Miami case. You know, do they have the integration clause in the contract, the one that says it's a complete contract? And if you don't tie it together, you could be obligated on the main contract, but not the addendum.
There you go. All right, so Lisa did a little clarification for us. Let's see if I can share this. She was referring to section 9 of the buyer broker agreement. Broker shall provide the above services and make properties available to buyer without regard to race, color, national origin, sex, handicap.
Ooh.
Broker will show buyer properties regardless of any seller concession being offered in connection thereof. So yes, you can, you know, that's why Patty was recommending that you still offer them the chance to see it no matter what, right? Because it says here in that section, broker will show buyer properties regardless of seller concession being offered. Buyer elects or declines to be shown properties where no seller concession is being offered in connection with the sale thereof. So yeah, you're right, Lisa. Thank you for pointing that out. You don't have to create special language, you just check the box.
There is a video on this, Christian. Joanna Watkins, General Counsel for the Florida Realtors, talks about this as being a potential lawsuit issue for selling brokers. You might find somebody who's in a protected class who just says to you, I can't afford the commission, so I can't afford this. So you, as a realtor, have no choice but to say, well, I can't represent you, unless I have a written agreement.
Yeah.
And you might want to have a witness, and Joanna's saying this, you might want to have a witness in the room where there'd be no accusation that you did this because of their race, their sex, or whatever protected class they happen to be in. And I know from personal experience, we've had that happen with the company, where we've given routine advice on landlord-tenant matters, and then we find out that the tenant's deaf, and she filed a HUD complaint against the company. So you got to watch yourself. And personally, when I've turned down clients, I've been sued over that. You got to be really careful when you turn people down. It's nice to have a witness, because their feelings get hurt. I mean, they do.
Absolutely. To kind of finalize things, I wanted to point everybody to, we spent a lot of time talking about NABOR, but FloridaRealtors.org is also doing a lot of work to update their forms. And there is a wonderful website here. This is on FloridaRealtors.org, and they talk about the NAR settlement, and they give updates, including the latest updated forms. So you've got two forms here. One is the credit related to buyer broker's compensation. This form may be used when a seller agrees to give credit to a buyer in a transaction when the buyer has entered into a separate BBA and elects to apply the credit towards that compensation. So that would be this form right here, credit related to buyer broker's compensation. So you'd fill this in, and that would be attached as a rider or to so it's a rider to the FAR/BAR contract or the FAR contract. And then separately, seller's agreement with respect to buyer broker's compensation. So this would be the form that FAR has related to broker compensation. So seller's agreement with respect to buyer broker's compensations. Contract is contingent upon either seller broker and buyer broker, or seller and buyer broker executing compensation. So Dad, to finalize on some of this stuff, every broker is doing things a little bit differently. Some of the brokers are so lackadaisical that they're just sitting and waiting. They've actually told me that, we're not doing anything until November when the settlement is formal. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then separately, you have other brokers that are so incredibly strict, they're actually fining their clients or their agents, $5,000, $10,000, even $15,000. And then there are obviously the brokers that are somewhere in between. What's your opinion on what is the appropriate way for an agent to react to how their broker is managing things? What is the best advice you could give to say, like, do you fight the system? Do you just try and understand it? Do you do something in between? What would you think?
I would start learning like now, no matter what my broker says. It's helpful to see the evolution of the form. What they're talking about now, what they adopted now may be modified by the time it's adopted formally by the court. But secondly, you can only absorb so much within a certain time frame. I mean, at some point, your eyes glaze over and you say, what the hell? And you lose all of it. So the earlier you start learning is never wasted, in my opinion. Study it now. It gives you a chance to compare NABOR, FAR/BAR, which one you're comfortable with. I just don't see any valid reason why you wouldn't want to learn something now.
Yeah. So I read this really interestingly. I thought it was really cool. They said he believes that people have overblown the effects in the short term and underblown the effects in the long term of this NAR settlement.
Your buddy Rob?
They're over hyper focused on the short term, the next 6 months, and how drastically different. But after the 6 months, everything will be fine. We'll figure it out. It'll be okay. He goes, I think trying to stay some consistency is important. Here's my advice after talking to hundreds and hundreds of agents and brokers on this. I think that the change is very real. The ability to sell it and to sell yourself that doesn't change. That actually is pretty straightforward. Your value to the deal and to the customers needs to be there. And that is something that you need to focus on. But as far as the forms and how this is going to work, it's complex. It is very complex. So who you were and why you are good at what you do, that's not changing ever. If you're good, you'll have a role. How that role will be defined, how much you'll make in that new role, that's to be determined. But your role is secure, because if you're a good agent, if you're a good attorney, if you're a good lender, I need you here as much as anyone else does. Like, we need you all there. But long term, the changes that are being required of us, the disclosures that are being required, the updates, and the constant flow, it's very real. It's a big, big deal. So like you said, Dad, you got to always learn, and but you have to have confidence in yourself to get there. The changes are very real. It is complex. It's a pain in the neck. In fact, I'll throw myself under the bus. I get a call pretty much every day of like, why'd you say that? I can't help it. People ask an opinion and I have it, but I'm not the broker, so it puts me in a weird spot. So
I usually say because I felt like it.
yeah, obviously I'm making it up as I go. No, I mean, it's
Your
not,
question.
Downing Fry doesn't necessarily agree with every advice I have. Premier Plus doesn't agree with everyone. Compass, John R. Wood, William Ravis, all the wonderful brokers that we work with, they don't see eye to eye on every deal or every particular issue that you and I see, Dad. You and I don't even agree on every.
Well, I don't, I mean, there's not a person on the planet who agrees with everything I say. Seriously, Christian.
That's going on TikTok, Dad, for sure.
I mean, can you say that you have one person on the planet who agrees with everything you say?
I thought that was you.
No. You lie and I'll swear to it.
All right, that's good. So Andy says on a follow-up, is there any chance the settlement can be overturned on appeal? Yeah, it's actually not on appeal. It will be in front of the judge who has to approve it. So it actually hasn't been approved by the judge. It's very similar in my simple analogy. It's similar to a divorce where the parties have agreed on a mutual settlement, and then it goes to the judge to approve it. So that's where we're at. The parties, the plaintiffs and defendants, have agreed to a settlement, and now the judge has to approve it. That won't happen until at least November. So it is possible that it gets rejected and sent back, but probably not across the board. It's not going to get rejected completely. If it gets pushed back, it's going to be like, hey, we don't like point 1.2, or we don't like point number 8. Let's modify it. They send it back, the parties renegotiate, and then they try and submit it back to the judge. So it's not going to change. NAR has accepted this, and we're trying to make it work.
The department does get involved if they feel like there's workarounds that are circumventing the intent of the settlement.
Yeah, and that probably won't happen before November.
No.
That'll probably be something that would come in a year or two from now after they see how things play.
They're all waiting to see how this works out, whether people comply with the spirit or not.
Sigrid makes our final, this will be our exit ramp here. Can I mix and match FAR with NABOR with FAR? For example, NABOR sales contract with a FAR addendum. There's two answers. The simple answer that people have always given agents, the simplest answer that people have always given agents, the way they've taught it, the way the instructors are taught to teach it, is no, you can't, right? That's simple, because the real answer is complex. The real answer is maybe, right, Dad? So you've got generally, yes, you can mix and match forms generally, because you don't need a FAR NABOR form to do a deal. You can make it up as you go. You can talk to an attorney. You can have things written up. You don't want to be practicing law, but if you're doing it for yourself, or if you're hiring an attorney to do it, yes, you can make up whatever contracts you want. You can mix and match. You can copy and paste. It's fine if you know what you're doing.
You have to know what you're doing.
A
classic example is the buyer's election NABOR form. You do not use that with a FAR contract. Why? Yeah. They have different definitions, different terms that do not apply in the FAR contract.
Yes, we did. I have a client that they made an offer on a FAR bar contract standard, and then they
Right.
used the NABOR buyer election seller response. And it actually gets the job done generally, but it's not the right form. It's a problem. You don't want to use that. It has things on the form that are not applicable at all. It talks about response times. It talks about the ability to terminate. None of those are applicable in a FAR bar standard contract. So generally the answer is try not to, but if you're going to, or if you have to, call an attorney, call your broker, and get permission on those specific mix and matches. So you can, but
These forms, in my opinion, are safe to use because they do not refer to the main body of either contract. It's just
Yeah.
a simple contract between you and your buyer, or a simple contract between you and your owner.
yeah, most of the forms that we looked at today, compensation agreement, buyer broker agreement, listing agreement, mix and match them as much as you want. That's not, they don't really refer to each other in any way at all. You could use some of these addendums, like the concession addendum. I think you can use that without problem on either form, but it does look somewhat unprofessional if you're using a NABOR contract with a FAR bar HOA rider. I wouldn't do that. I think that's a huge problem. Or even worse, if you use a NABOR sales contract with or I guess it would be a NABOR sales contract, FAR bar sales contract with a NABOR HOA rider or NABOR HOA disclosure. That is a huge no-no. You can't do that. That makes your contract voidable completely by a buyer. So don't do that one. So you can see why it's really difficult, because your eyes just glazed over. So and to that point, I'm going to send you guys free into the wild. And if you need me, just call us. Right, Dad?
Yes,
All
we're
right.
here.
Bye, guys. Good luck.